The quilt had taken Edna Shelton the better part of 3 years to finish, and in all that time, she had never once met the man whose name she had sewn into the very center of it. It started the way most peculiar things in Edna's life started, with her grandmother sitting in the rocking chair beside the cold hearth, wrapping her gnarled fingers around a cup of black coffee, and saying something so matter-of-fact that Edna nearly dropped the spoon she was stirring with. "You're going to marry a man named Nathan Merritt," her grandmother had said, calm as you please, in the autumn of 1873. "I dreamed it twice. That means it's true." Edna had laughed it off naturally. She was 21 years old, living in the small Kansas town of Millhaven, and she had better things to do than stitch some stranger's name into fabric because her grandmother had a dream. Her grandmother, Hattie Shelton, was a woman of enormous faith and enormous imagination, and Edna loved her fiercely for both, even when those qualities led to extraordinary inconveniences. But Hattie had been so certain. She had pressed Edna's hands between her own and looked at her with those faded blue eyes that still somehow saw everything, and she had said, "When you find him, you give him something made by your hands, something with his name on it. So he knows you were waiting before you even knew his face." Edna had gone home that night, and because she could never fully refuse her grandmother anything, she had pulled out her needlework basket. She had chosen a square of deep blue cotton the color of a winter sky just before snow, and she had begun. Nathan. Nathan, the letters forming slowly beneath the lamplight, her needle pulling thread through fabric with the patience of someone who does not fully believe in what she is doing but cannot stop herself from doing it anyway. Over the following 3 years, the single square grew into something magnificent. She sewed squares of calico and muslin, of flour sack cloth and remnants of her mother's old dresses. She pieced them together in a log cabin pattern that her mother had taught her, working on the quilt during the long winter evenings and the slow Sunday afternoons. She sewed in the seasons she lived through. A square of yellow gingham from the summer her father's old horse finally gave out. A square of brown flannel from the winter. The creek froze so solid that the Miller boys drove a wagon across it on a dare. A square of white cotton from the Sunday she watched her best friend Ruth marry Thomas Hale and felt, for the first time, the strange loneliness of being 23 and still waiting. And always at the center of it his name, Nathan Merritt. Sewn in blue thread so dark it was nearly black, the letters precise, and even because Edna Shelton did not do anything carelessly. She told no one about the name. Her grandmother knew, but Hattie Shelton had passed quietly in the spring of 1875, leaving Edna the rocking chair, the farm, and the memory of the dream. Edna kept both the chair and the secret. The farm sat on the eastern edge of Millhaven, 40 acres of Kansas prairie that her father had broken his back over, and her mother had watered with a great many tears. Both her parents were gone now, her father taken by a fever 6 years past, and her mother following him 2 years after, worn out with grief in the particular way that people who are too devoted to one person sometimes are. Edna had inherited the farm and the practical knowledge of how to run it, and she had done exactly that, hiring on a hand named Clem Busby who was 53, half-deaf, and entirely trustworthy. She was not unhappy. She wanted that understood, if only by herself, sitting on the porch in the blue evenings watching the prairie go gold and then dark. She had her work and her land and her good neighbors and her friendship with Ruth Hale, who had 2 small children now and always seemed slightly astonished by the fact. Edna was not pining. She was simply waiting, the way the prairie waited for rain, with patience that was not the same thing as resignation. Then, in the spring of 1876, a letter arrived at the Millhaven post office addressed to her, and everything that had been still began to move. The letter was from a man named George Alderman, who ran the land registry office in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, some 60 miles south and west of Millhaven. Mr. Alderman wrote to inform her that her late uncle, Frederick Shelton, her father's older brother, a man she had met exactly twice in her childhood and remembered as a rough-bearded figure who smelled of horses and leather had died without a will. And as his nearest surviving kin, Edna stood to inherit his property, which consisted of a house, a small parcel of land, and a livestock operation of moderate size on the outskirts of Caldwell. Edna read the letter twice at the post office counter while old Harold Briggs pretended to sort mail, and actually listened to every word she was saying under her breath. Then she walked home slowly, reading it a third time, and sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought very carefully about what this meant. She had no deep attachment to Millhaven beyond Ruth and Clem and the habit of the place. Her farm was decent but small, and the soil had been fighting her the last 2 seasons. Caldwell was a cow town, rougher and livelier than Millhaven, sitting on the Kisham Trail where the cattle drives came through every spring and summer. It was not a quiet life she'd find there, but it was a new one. She wrote back to Mr. Alderman within the week, confirming her intention to come and see to the inheritance. She told Clem, who shrugged and said he supposed he'd find work somewhere, and she told Ruth, who cried a little and made Edna promise to write every single week, which Edna promised knowing she would write every other week and that Ruth would forgive her for it. She packed her belongings into 2 trunks, wrapped the quilt carefully in brown paper because she could not have explained why she was bringing it except that she always brought it, and made arrangements to travel south on the stage line to Caldwell. The journey took 2 days and was thoroughly unpleasant in the way of all stage travel, which was loud and dusty, and involved 3 strangers pressed against her sides with varying degrees of courtesy. She arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in late April of 1876, stepping down from the coach into a main street that smelled of horses and coal smoke, and the particular muddy richness of a town, still deciding what it was going to be. Caldwell in 1876 was a border town in more ways than one. It sat at the edge of the Indian Territory, and it sat at the edge of lawfulness, and it sat at the edge of whatever Kansas was becoming now that the cattle trade was pushing through it every season. The main street had a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a church that looked slightly embarrassed to be there, and Mr. Alderman's land registry office, which Edna found without difficulty and entered with her traveling hat still dusty from the road. George Alderman was a small, fussy man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who seemed pleased to have resolved the matter of Frederick Shelton's estate. He went through the paperwork with her at considerable length, explained the details of the property, and provided her with the key to Frederick's house, which was, he said, about 2 miles north of town on a creek called Bluestem Creek. "Your uncle was a quiet man, Mr. Alderman said, folding his hands on the desk, kept to himself mostly. The ranch hand who worked for him, fellow by the name of Cutter, moved on after your uncle passed. You'll find the property in fair condition. A few of the neighbors have been keeping an eye on things." "Which neighbors?" Edna asked because she was a practical woman who liked to know these things. Mr. Alderman looked at his papers. "The Merritt operation is the closest, about a mile east of your place. They run cattle primarily. Nathan Merritt runs it now, since his father passed a couple of years back. Good family. He'll be a helpful neighbor, I expect." The name hit Edna so hard in the chest that she had to grip the edge of his desk to keep from showing it on her face. She heard herself say, in a voice that sounded remarkably normal, "Nathan Merritt, I see." "You know him?" Mr. Alderman asked. "No," Edna said honestly. "I don't believe I do." She left the office in a state that she could only describe to herself as organized chaos, which was the condition of a person whose outer manner remains composed while their interior is conducting a full-scale argument. She stood on the boardwalk outside the land registry and breathed the spring air of Caldwell, which still smelled of horses and mud, and she thought, "This is a coincidence. This is a remarkable, startling coincidence, and nothing more. There are probably many men named Nathan Merritt in Kansas, and one of them happened to be her neighbor by accident, and she was not going to make anything of it beyond that. She retrieved her trunks from the stage depot and hired a man with a wagon to take her out to the property. The road north was rutted but navigable, and the prairie on either side of it was coming alive with the first green of spring, the grasses just finding their color after the long brown winter. She could see the silver thread of Bluestem Creek in the distance, willows lining its banks with new yellow-green leaves. Frederick Shelton's house was small and square and smelled of vacancy, the way houses do when no one has breathed inside them for a while. But the bones of it were good. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above, a solid stone fireplace, a covered porch facing west. Behind it, a barn in reasonable repair, a chicken coop that needed attention, and 40 acres of creek-bottom land that looked far better than anything she'd left in Millhaven. She spent her first evening opening windows, wiping surfaces, and taking inventory. She found her uncle's possessions with the detached curiosity she might bring to any stranger's life. His worn Bible, his coffee tin, his single good coat, his calendar still turned to February. She fed herself on hard biscuits she'd brought from town and went to bed in the loft with the quilt spread over her because the April nights in Kansas were still cold, and she fell asleep with the name Nathan Merritt turning through her thoughts like a wheel that had found its groove. In the morning she met him. She had not planned it. She was in the yard, studying the state of the chicken coop and concluding that it needed new latching before she could think about chickens, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see a rider turning in at her gate. He was riding a bay horse, a good animal, and he sat it the way men who have grown up on horseback do, with a loose, easy economy that is not carelessness but something better than it. He was wearing a brown work coat and a hat pushed back slightly from his face, and when he got close enough for her to see his features clearly, she thought he looked like the kind of person the land made, angular and direct and not unkind. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she guessed, dark hair under the hat, brown eyes that assessed and then settled with something like warmth. He had a jaw that had not been shaved in 2 or 3 days, and his hands, when he pulled up the bay and touched his hat to her, were the hands of a man who worked with them. "Miss Shelton," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, with a steadiness to it that was neither drawl nor formal, just Kansas plain. "That's right," she said. "Nathan Merritt," he said. "My place is east of yours, along the creek. Alderman told me you were coming. Thought I'd ride over and see if you needed anything." Edna Shelton, who had sewn this man's name into the center of a quilt she had been carrying for 3 years, looked up at him from beside a broken chicken coop and said, with perfect composure, "That's very neighborly of you, Mr. Merritt. I could use some advice about this coop latch, if you have a moment." He swung down from the bay without hesitation, tied the horse to the fence post, and came to look at the latch with the genuine interest of a man who considers practical problems worth his attention. They stood side by side and discussed the coop for several minutes, and he told her what sort of hardware she'd need from the general store, and she thanked him, and they talked about the creek and the soil and the cattle drives that came through in summer and the general character of the county. He was easy to talk to. That surprised her, not because she expected him to be difficult, but because she had spent 3 years building an idea of this name in her head, turning it over like a stone, and the reality of a person is so much more complicated than the idea of one. He was real in a way that was both simpler and more interesting than anything she had imagined. He had opinions about spring grass and opinions about the stage depot in Caldwell being understaffed, and he had a neighbor's fence dispute he mentioned with a kind of resigned humor that suggested he had made his peace with it. He stayed half an hour and then remounted the bay, and said he'd check in again in a few days, and rode east along the creek road, and Edna watched him go with her arms crossed over her chest, and her heart doing something she chose not to name yet. She said nothing to anyone about the quilt. She put it away in the cedar chest at the foot of the loft bed, folded carefully under her winter blankets, and told herself firmly that whatever her grandmother had dreamed, she was not going to rush a single thing. She threw herself into the work of the property instead, which was abundant and honest and required her full attention. She got 24 chickens from a woman in town named Mrs. Patton, fixed the coop latch with the hardware Nathan had recommended, and began the process of assessing what the 40 acres could support. She found that the creek bottom soil was rich and that her uncle had been running a small beef operation, nothing like the Merritt scale, but workable. She wrote to Ruth in Millhaven and described the property without once mentioning the neighbor. She wrote to Clem and told him the new owner of the Millhaven farm was going to need a hand, which was the closest she could come to finding him employment from a distance. Then she walked her fences and thought. Nathan Merritt came back 5 days later with a side of beef wrapped in cloth, which he delivered to her door with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who considers it normal to feed his neighbors. He said one of his steers had needed putting down early, and there was more than he could use, and the look on his face dared her to make a polite fuss about charity. She didn't. She took the beef with direct gratitude and offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they sat at her kitchen table in the morning light and talked for an hour. She learned things about him in that hour that she filed away with the care of a person who knows they are learning something important. He had grown up on the Merritt place, born there in 1848, which made him 27 to her 24. His father, Walter Merritt, had built the operation from almost nothing in the early 1860s and had been, by Nathan's account, a hard man who was fair, which Nathan seemed to consider the highest possible compliment. His mother had come from Missouri and had died of typhoid fever when Nathan was 12, and he spoke of this with the particular flatness of a loss that has been lived with long enough to be part of the landscape rather than a wound. He had a younger sister, Clara, who had married a man in Wichita and sent letters every few weeks that Nathan read, and then set on the mantelpiece, because he did not always know how to write back. He asked about her in turn, the questions of a man who is genuinely curious and knows how to listen. She told him about her parents and the Millhaven farm and her grandmother Hattie, though she did not tell him what Hattie had said. She told him she had been running a farm alone for 4 years and intended to continue running this one, and she watched to see what he made of that. He nodded once, the kind of nod that means a person has heard what you said and has no argument with it, and she found she liked him quite considerably for that nod. He left when the morning was tilting toward noon, and she stood in the doorway watching him go and thought, very carefully, about the quilt in the cedar chest. She pressed the thought back down. May came in with warmth and wind, and the cattle drive started coming up the Kishom Trail. Caldwell grew loud and unpredictable in the way of all cow towns during driving season, and Edna had been warned about this by 6 people before she experienced it. The main street filled with trail hands who were dirty and tired and glad to be at the end of a long haul from Texas, and the saloons ran all night, and the hotel was always full, and Mr. Briggs at the general store ran out of tobacco every other week. Nathan was busy during driving season, handling his own cattle and doing some buying and selling at the stockyards, and she saw him less. But he stopped by when he could, usually in the late afternoon with some practical purpose, a fence question or a weather concern, or once a very fine piece of information about a soil amendment technique that he'd read about in an agricultural pamphlet that she found unexpectedly charming. The idea of this cowboy sitting up reading agricultural pamphlets by lamplight. She had other neighbors too, and the community of Caldwell drew her in gradually. She joined the women's sewing circle at the church, which met on Wednesday afternoons, and was run by a forthright woman named Dorothea Fisk, who had strong opinions about everything, and expressed them pleasantly enough that most people enjoyed hearing them. Through Dorothea, Edna met the doctor's wife, Louise Hawthorne, who was small and quiet and knew every piece of news in Caldwell before anyone else, and a young woman named Patience Reeves, who had come out from Ohio the previous year to teach school, and was still slightly astonished to find herself in Kansas. These women became her people in the way that small community friendships form, through the accumulation of ordinary afternoons, shared meals, and the honest exchange of difficulties. She told Dorothea about the chicken coop and the soil, and Dorothea told her about the cattlemen who tried to bully small landholders in the county, and the injustice of the open-range arguments that always seemed to favor the men with the most cattle and the loudest voices, which had been a running grievance in Caldwell County for some years. Small farmers and homesteaders had their rights under the law, but the law in cow-country towns was not always applied with perfect impartiality, and Edna filed this information away with the practical seriousness it deserved. She was at the sewing circle on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of May when Dorothea mentioned Nathan Merritt's name. "He's a good man," Dorothea said, threading a needle with the efficiency of long practice. "Doesn't try to bully the small operators the way some of the bigger cattlemen do. His father wasn't the same. Mind you, Walter Merritt had a hard elbow when it came to water rights, but Nathan's different." "I've found him to be a good neighbor," Edna said, keeping her voice as neutral as the weather. Louise Hawthorne looked up from her sewing with a small smile that said she had noticed the neutrality and was not fooled by it. Edna did not respond to the smile. But that evening, alone in her kitchen with the last of the daylight coming through the west window, she thought about what Dorothea had said. A good man. She had been discovering this for herself, slowly and practically, the way you discover good land, by working it a little, by seeing how it held up, by noticing what it was willing to give. She took the quilt out of the cedar chest that night for the first time since she'd arrived. She unfolded it on the loft bed and looked at it in the lamplight, all those squares that held the texture of her years, the blue gingham and the brown flannel and the white cotton and all the others, pieced together in the log cabin pattern, and there at the center his name, Nathan Merritt. The stitching was still perfect, blue-black thread on the deep blue cot, precise and deliberate as an intention. She sat beside it for a long time. Then she folded it back up, put it in the chest, and went to bed. The thing between them grew the way prairie fires grow in dry grass, not all at once, but with the kind of steady expansion that you don't fully perceive until suddenly the whole landscape has changed. It was in the way he began to linger a little longer each visit, in the way she began to put out 2 cups without being asked when she heard a horse on the road, in the particular quality of the silences between them, which are very different from the silences of 2 people who have nothing to say, and much more like the silences of 2 people who are saying something without using words. In late May, her fence line along the creek broke under a high-water event, and she lost 2 days' work trying to address it, and Nathan appeared on the first afternoon with fence wire and a post driver, and 2 of his hands, a young Mexican vaquero named Louis, and an older man called Sims who chewed tobacco, with the dedication of a man who has made a decision about his habits. They fixed the fence in an afternoon, and afterward she fed all of them supper at the big table, and the kitchen was loud with men's voices and the smell of beef stew and cornbread, and she stood at the stove with her back to the room and felt, in a startling rush, how much she had missed exactly this. When Louis and Sims had ridden back, Nathan stayed to help her carry dishes to the wash basin, which he did with the natural ease of a man who grew up in a house without enough women in it and therefore never drew sharp distinctions about what was men's work and what wasn't. They washed the dishes side by side, and the kitchen had gone quiet, and at some point she realized that their hands had brushed in the wash basin water twice and neither of them had moved away. "Thank you," she said, "for the fence. For the help. Your land, you'd have got to it," he said. "I just made it faster." "Still," she said. He looked at her then, a full, direct look that did not have any of the practiced indirectness that men often use when they are trying to conceal what they are feeling. He had brown eyes that were warmer than the rest of his face, which was a face that knew how to be still. "I wanted to help," he said simply. She did not say anything to that. But she looked back at him with equal directness, and something passed between them in the quiet kitchen that was more than furniture and less than a declaration. And then he said good night and took his hat from the peg and left. She stood at the kitchen window for a while after, watching his lamplight move across the dark fields toward his place, and thought about the quilt in the cedar chest. Not yet, she told herself. She didn't know why not yet, only that it was important to do things in the right order, and she hadn't arrived at the moment yet. She would know it when she did. June came. The cattle drives were thick now, and Caldwell was at full roar. The saloons spilling noise into the street at all hours and the stockyards full and fragrant in the summer heat. There was a difficulty in town in early June. A trail boss from Texas named Harker, who had too much whiskey in him and too little respect for property lines, got into a dispute with a homesteader family named Greer, tore down their fence, and let his herd trample their kitchen garden. And when Mrs. Greer tried to file a complaint with the town marshal, she was told that trail rights on the Kishom took precedence, and there was little to be done. Edna heard about this from Dorothea with the particular low fury of a woman who has been told, in one form or another, that the rights of the small are always subordinate to the convenience of the large. She went to the Greer place with Dorothea and Louise and Patience, and they helped Mrs. Greer clear the crushed garden and replant what could be salvaged. And they listened to her tell the story with the kind of listening that is also a form of bearing witness. Tom Greer had tried to confront Harker, and had been knocked down in the street by two of Harker's hands before anyone intervened, and had come home with a black eye and the dull expression of a man who has been shown the limits of his own power. When Nathan heard about it, she told him herself, over coffee, the following morning. His jaw tightened in a way she had not seen before. "Harker's a bully with a big herd," he said. "He's been through here before. The marshal doesn't push back because Harker brings money into town." "It's wrong," Edna said plainly. "It is," Nathan agreed with the same plainness. "The Greers have a homestead claim, that's federal. Harker doesn't have the right." He paused. "I'll talk to the marshal." "Will it do any good?" he considered. "Maybe not, but I'll do it anyway." He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again. "Some things you do because they're right even when the outcome isn't guaranteed." She looked at him over her own cup and thought, yes, this is him. This is the kind of man he is. He did talk to the marshal, and whether it was Nathan's weight in the county or the accumulation of complaints, Harker was required to pay damages to the Greers before he moved his herd north, and Tom Greer got an apology that was somewhat less than gracious but was still an apology. It was not complete justice, but it was something, and in Caldwell in 1876, something was often what you got. Edna began to understand, gradually, the geography of Nathan Merritt's character. He was not a man given to easy displays. He did not make declarations or compliments readily. These had to be worked for or waited for, and when they came quietly and meant the more for it. But he was there. That was the truest thing about him. He showed up, with fence wire or a side of beef or an agricultural pamphlet, with his bay horse tied to her gate and his hat pushed back and his direct brown eyes, and he was simply, reliably, always there. In the second week of June, there was a community dance at the church hall, a summer social that Dorothea organized with the efficient enthusiasm she brought to all civic events. Edna went with Patience and Louise, and the hall was bright with lantern light and crowded with Caldwell's residents in their best, and a fiddle player and a banjo player in the corner were producing music of more energy than polish. Nathan was there, which did not surprise her. He was with Sims and Lewis and two other ranch hands, standing at the edge of the room with the posture of men who have been told by social convention that they are supposed to be at a dance, and are prepared to fulfill that obligation without necessarily enjoying it. But when the dancing started, Nathan did dance, and he danced well. She was surprised to discover, not with the studied elegance of a ballroom, but with the honest rhythm of a man who knows how to move and is not embarrassed about it. He asked her for a dance in the middle of the evening, coming over with his hat in his hand, and a question in his eyes that he kept from being quite a question by keeping his expression neutral. She said yes, and they took the floor for a reel, and she discovered that dancing with Nathan Merritt was very much like talking with Nathan Merritt, easy in a way that was not simple, comfortable in a way that required no performance. He held her hand with the right degree of grip, not tentative and not presumptuous, and when the reel required them to turn together, they turned exactly right. Afterward, when the reel ended and they stepped back and the room was loud around them, he kept hold of her hand for a moment longer than the dance required. Just a moment. Then he let go and looked at her, and she looked back, and the whole hall fell away to irrelevance for several seconds. They danced twice more that evening, and walked home in the same direction since their properties were along the same road north, and the night was wide and full of stars, and the prairie sang with insects, and they walked slowly without either of them suggesting they should walk faster. He left her at her gate and said good night, and she said good night, and went inside and stood in her kitchen with her back against the door and her heart making its argument to the rest of her. She went to the cedar chest that night. She took the quilt out and unfolded it all the way, spreading it across her bed in the lamplight so she could see all of it, every square and every seam and the name at the center. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a long time. Her grandmother's voice came back to her, clear as creek water. When you find him, you give him something made by your hands, something with his name on it, so he knows you were waiting before you even knew his face. She had been waiting. She had not known she was waiting, or rather she had known and had called it something else, called it living and working and being patient, but that was what it was. And now she had found him, or he had found her, or they had found each other in the practical way of two people whose lives put them on the same creek road at the same time. But she was still afraid. Not of him. She was not afraid of Nathan Merritt, who was the least frightening person she had encountered in recent memory. She was afraid of the quilt itself, of what it would mean to hand it to him. 3 years of work and faith in a dream, and the belief that something was coming, all folded up in brown and blue cotton. What if he looked at it and did not understand? What if he was kind about it in the polite, distant way of a man who has just been handed something strange by someone he is still deciding about? What if the name in the center made him back away from her? She folded the quilt carefully back into the cedar chest and told herself to be patient a little longer. The summer of 1876 moved through its long hot middle, the prairie burning gold under a sun that forgot nothing. Edna worked her land and expanded her small operation, buying 3 head of cattle to run with the grass she had along the creek, and began to talk about planting a proper kitchen garden the following spring. She read the papers when patients brought them from town, which meant she read about the events of the wider world, the nation's centennial celebration in Philadelphia, the ongoing conflicts in the territories, the murder of Wild Bill Hickok up in Deadwood in August, which went through Caldwell like a cold wind, and reminded everyone that the West was still not entirely civilized and probably didn't intend to be anytime soon. She and Nathan had fallen into a pattern that was more than neighbors and less than an understanding, which was an uncomfortable in-between space, but one that neither of them seemed in a hurry to resolve. He came to her property several times a week now, and she went to his once or twice, invited to dinner by his housekeeper, a Tejano woman named Consuela who cooked with a directness and skill that made Edna both envious and grateful. She met his horses, which he kept with serious attention, including a tall gray mare he called December that he seemed particularly fond of and spoke to in a low murmur, while grooming her that Edna found disproportionately affecting. She met a few of his friends, the men he did business with and respected, and she met the county assessor and the school board member who came out for suppers at his place, and she noticed the way he was around these people, steady and fair, and not given to impressing anyone unnecessarily. He said what he thought, and listened when others spoke, and held his ground when he had to without making it more of an event than it needed to be. She fell in love with him in July, Or rather, she admitted in July that she had been falling since April, and the falling was complete and had landed. She admitted it to herself on a Tuesday evening when he came over to help her move a piece of timber that had fallen across her barn door in a thunderstorm the night before, and they spent 2 hours shifting it with ropes and a pry bar, getting increasingly sweaty and frustrated and laughing at the absurdity of it. And when they finally had it clear, they both sat down on the barn steps, and she was laughing still, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Soft and unguarded and entirely focused, and she thought, clear as a bell, I love him. Not I am interested in him, or he is a good man, or there could be something here. Just simply, purely, I love him. She said nothing. She sat on the barn steps and laughed and caught her breath, and the moment passed into the evening, but she carried it home inside her like a coal under her ribs, warm and steady and requiring tending. She had to tell him. That was the part she kept arriving at and then shying away from. She had to tell him, but more than that, she had to give him the quilt, because the quilt was the thing her grandmother had told her to give, and because 3 years of her life were in it, and because if she was going to love this man, she was not going to start by keeping the most honest thing about herself hidden in a cedar chest. She just needed to find the right time. She told herself this for 2 weeks, revising the right time every few days, moving it just a little further out the way you do when you want to do something and are also terrified of it. What brought her to it, finally, was not a romantic moment at all. It was an afternoon in early August when she went over to his place to return a book he'd lent her. He did read. She had confirmed. Not just agricultural pamphlets, but novels, which she thought was interesting in a man who seemed purely practical until you started paying attention. And she found him on his porch with a letter in his hand, and an expression on his face that was quiet in a different way than his usual quiet, the kind of quiet that is containing something large. She stopped at the porch steps. Bad news, he looked up. My sister Clara, her husband was thrown from a horse last month. He's all right mostly, but he can't work the way he did. She's asking if there's any possibility she could come back here for a while, her and the children. He looked at the letter again. There are 2 children, a boy 4 years old and a girl 18 months. Will you have her? Edna asked. He looked at her. Of course I'll have her. She's my sister. A pause. The house is going to be different. Different is not always bad. He looked at the letter for another moment, then set it on his knee and looked at the prairie. And she saw something in his profile that she recognized, because she had felt it herself in the early days after her parents died. The look of a person who has been given a life that is bigger and more complicated than the one they planned for, and is gathering themselves to meet it. No, he said, it isn't. She sat down on the porch step without being asked, and they sat together in the long late afternoon light with the cicadas going in the grass, and she thought, now. Not because the moment was perfect, it wasn't, it was ordinary and a little melancholy, but because perfect was a reason not to do things, and she was done with that. I have to show you something, she said. He looked at her. Not here, she said. Come to my place tomorrow morning. I need to show you something I've been meaning to show you for a while. He studied her face in the way he had when he was trying to determine the nature of a thing before committing to it. Then he nodded. All right. She went home and took the quilt out of the cedar chest and set it on the kitchen table, still folded, and looked at it in the lamplight. She had the particular feeling of a person who has decided to jump and is now standing at the edge before the jump, when backing down would take more effort than going forward. She was 24 years old. She had brought this quilt from Millhaven to Caldwell because she could not bring it. She had stitched this man's name into it because her grandmother told her to, yes, but also because something in her had believed the dream the same way you believe in creek water, not with argument but with the evidence of your senses. And she had been right. Here was Nathan Merritt, exactly 1 mile east along Bluestem Creek, with his bay horse and his agricultural pamphlets and his gray mare December and his quiet that was full of weather. She did not sleep well. In the morning, she made coffee early and put out 2 cups and waited. She heard his horse at 7:30, which was earlier than she'd expected, and which told her something about his own state of mind. She went to the door and he was tying the bay at the gate, and when he came up the path and saw her face, he stopped just short of the porch. "What is it?" he said. "Come inside," she said. "Please." He came in. The quilt was on the kitchen table, still folded in its brown paper wrapping the way she'd carried it from Millhaven. She had rewrapped it, wanting the full ceremony of it, the unfolding. He looked at the parcel on the table and then at her. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured his coffee and her own and sat across from him, and she put her hands flat on the table and said, "I'm going to tell you something that is going to sound very strange. I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He nodded. His hands were around his coffee cup and his face was still, and he was listening with his full attention, which was one of the things she had come to value most in him. So she told him. She told him about her grandmother Hattie and the rocking chair, and the cup of coffee, and the October morning in 1873, when Hattie had said, "You're going to marry a man named Nathan Merritt," as calmly as commenting on the weather. She told him about beginning the quilt that same night, the deep blue square with his name, and how she had built the quilt out around it over 3 years because she could not keep going once she'd started. She told him about Hattie passing and leaving her the farm and the rocking chair and the dream, and about the letter from Alderman arriving in the spring and the name Merritt in his note, and coming to Caldwell and meeting him at the broken chicken coop with her heart in her throat. She told him all of this in a plain, direct voice, not embellishing and not hedging, and when she was done, she pushed the brown paper parcel across the table to him and said, "This is for you. It's always been for you." He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached out and unfolded the brown paper. The quilt came open under his hands. He unfolded it carefully, deliberately, pulling it out and spreading it on the table between them, and she watched his face as he took it in, the log cabin pattern, the colors of her years, the fine seaming and the careful work. His eyes moved over it the way a person reads something important, slowly, taking in each part, and then they found the center. He unfolded it and could not speak. She watched him look at his name in the center of her quilt. Nathan Merritt, in blue-black thread on deep blue cotton, precise and even and absolutely intentional. She watched the stillness of his face change in some interior way, not on the surface but underneath, the way light changes when the sun goes behind a cloud, except in reverse, not less but more. Something opening rather than closing. His hands were on the quilt, touching the stitching of his name with one finger, tracing the letters, and he did not say anything. He could not say anything. She could see that clearly, could see that he was trying, and that the words were not available to him in that moment, which was all right, which was more than all right, because some things are too large for immediate speech, and a man who knows that about himself is a man she could love for a very long time. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were different than she had ever seen them, not wet, not overcome, but deeply, completely present, as if whatever he'd been keeping at some small distance from himself had stepped fully into the room. "Your grandmother dreamed me," he said. His voice was low and steady and careful, the way voices are when the speaker is putting something very important into very simple words. "She dreamed you," Edna said, "3 years before I found you." He looked down at his name in her quilt again. "You made this," he said. "You made this for me. Yes, before you knew my face. Before I knew anything about you except your name." He was quiet again. She let him be quiet. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window now, the Kansas summer morning going gold and clean, and the coffee was getting cold and neither of them had touched it. "Edna," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to tell you something since about the second week of May," he said, "and I have been very poor at finding it." She waited. "I think about you every day," he said, "every single day. I find reasons to come over here because I cannot think of any good reason not to." He paused. "I don't have a quilt. I don't have 3 years of evidence. I just have the fact of you and the fact that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and the fact that when I imagine the future, you are in it." Her hands were still flat on the table. She turned one over, palm up. He looked at it. Then he reached across the quilt with his name on it and put his hand in hers. They sat like that for a while, his hand in hers, his name spread between them on the table, the morning going fully gold outside the window, and nobody said anything for a good long time because nothing needed to be said. They talked for a long time after that, the way people do when something has been acknowledged and the floodgate is open. He told her things he hadn't said before about the loneliness of running a large operation alone, about the particular quality of evenings in a house where no one else was waiting, about the way his sister's letter had made him think about the shape of a life, and whether the shape he had was the one he wanted. She told him about Millhaven and the long evenings with the quilt and the feeling of building something for a destination you couldn't see, and about her parents and the grief of losing them and the discipline of continuing anyway. He asked her quietly if she loved him. The question came out of a pause and was entirely direct, the way he was about everything. "Yes," she said. "Since July at least, probably earlier." He looked at her with that expression she had seen on the porch when he'd looked at her laughing, soft and unguarded and entirely focused. "Since about the second week of May," he said. "I told you." She laughed, and he smiled, which was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and she thought she could look at that smile for the rest of her life without growing tired of it. He rode back to his place that morning with the quilt carefully refolded and under his arm. He had asked if he could keep it, which had not been something she'd anticipated but which felt completely right. "It's yours," she'd told him. "It's always been yours." He proposed to her formally 3 weeks later, on a Sunday evening on her porch with the prairie going pink and orange in the late light, standing with his hat in his hands and the straight-backed sincerity of a man who has thought carefully about every word. He told her that he would like her to marry him if she was willing, and that he understood this was not a small thing to ask, and that he had every intention of making it worthy of her, and that he loved her in a way that had settled into him permanently and was not going anywhere. She said yes. She said yes with her whole self, without qualification or reservation, and he put his hat on and kissed her for the first time in the pink prairie evening, his hands holding her face like something precious, and the prairie went dark around them while they stood on her porch and let the future open up. They were married in October of 1876 at the Caldwell church on a Saturday afternoon, with Dorothea Fisk in the front pew looking satisfied in the way of a woman whose convictions about people have been confirmed, and Patience Reeves crying in a manner entirely at odds with her name, and Louise Hawthorne watching with the quiet warmth that was her particular style. Nathan's sister Clara had arrived in September with her 2 small children, a boy named James and a baby girl named Edna, named before Clara had even met her future sister-in-law, which made Edna laugh out loud when she heard it, and which Nathan said was either remarkable coincidence or evidence of his grandmother's reach extending from both sides of the family. Nathan's ranch hand Louis stood up for him, grave and clean in his good vest, and Sims sat in the back and chewed his tobacco carefully and looked very moved despite himself. Ruth Hale came from Millhaven, having arranged for Thomas to manage the children, and she cried from the moment she walked through the church door to the moment she walked out again, and told Edna afterward that she looked radiant, which Edna was inclined to believe because she felt radiant. She felt lit from within. She felt like the woman her grandmother had dreamed about 3 years ago had finally, fully arrived at the life that had been waiting for her. They combined the properties after the wedding, running both operations under a shared management that made sense given how close the land was, and moved the center of their lives to the larger Merritt house, which had more room and the capacity to hold Clara and her children as well. The house, which had been the domain of a quiet man living alone, became something else entirely loud in the evenings with Clara's children running and quiet in the good mornings with Nathan and Edna at the kitchen table before the day began. Coffee cups and the newspaper, and the simple pleasure of another person's company who is also your home. Clara stayed through the winter and into the following spring while her husband Martin recovered fully, and in that time Edna and Clara became the kind of sisters-in-law who are genuinely also friends, which is rarer than it ought to be. Clara was warm and practical and funny in a self-deprecating way that reminded Edna of herself at 21, before the work of solitude had made her more measured. They talked about everything: their parents, the West, the ranch, the politics of the territory, and the shifting status of the land as the cattle drives changed the economy and the homesteaders pushed back. And once, late at night in the kitchen when the children were asleep and Nathan was out checking the horses, they talked about love, and Clara said something that stayed with Edna for a long time. "He wrote me about you in June," Clara said. "He didn't mean to say as much as he did. But he wrote about you for half the letter, and then he wrote about cattle for the other half, and I thought, he has absolutely no idea what he's doing." Edna laughed. "He had some idea. He was in love and trying to act like it was a practical matter," Clara said. "That's very Nathan. He would inventory his feelings given the chance." "He's learning not to," Edna said. Clara looked at her with a warmth that was also assessment. "Yes," she said, "he is." The quilt was on their bed. Nathan had asked her one evening early in their marriage if she would put it on the bed rather than in the chest, and she had done so without discussion because of course, yes, of course it belonged there. It was the quilt she had made for him, and now they slept under it, and that seemed right in a way that required no explanation. She had told him the whole story of it again, more slowly, over a winter evening by the fire, going through each square and what it held. The yellow gingham of the summer her father's horse died, the brown flannel of the frozen creek, the white cotton of Ruth's wedding. He had listened with the full attention he always brought to important things and asked questions that were both precise and tender, and when she showed him the center square with his name, he put his finger on the stitching the same way he had done the first morning at the kitchen table. "You made me before you knew me," he said. "I made a place for you," she said. "You were always going to be the one who filled it." He looked at her over the quilt in the firelight with that expression, the soft and unguarded one, and said, "How did Hattie know?" "I don't know," Edna said honestly. "I stopped needing to know. She knew and she told me, and here you are." He pulled her close. There on the settle by the fire with the quilt across their laps, and she settled against him and listened to the fire and the wind outside and the occasional sound from upstairs where Clara and the children slept, and she felt the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth building around. In the spring of 1877, Edna discovered she was expecting a child. She told Nathan on a March morning in the kitchen, setting a cup of coffee in front of him and saying it plainly, the way she said everything important, and watching the same thing happen in his face that had happened the first time he'd seen his name in the quilt, that inward opening, that going fully present. He stood up from the table and held her for a long time without speaking, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek and thought this was one of the best mornings she had ever spent. Clara, who was still with them through the early spring while Martin finished his recovery, clapped her hands and then cried, which was the Clara sequence for almost any significant news. She departed in April, taking James and little Edna back to Wichita on the stage, with promises to return as often as she could and Martin's genuine gratitude for Nathan's patience expressed through Clara's characteristic 3-page letter. The pregnancy went well, despite the heat of the Kansas summer and the physical demands of a ranch that required her active participation. Nathan was attentive without being anxious, which was the exact calibration she needed. He was present, he was careful, he helped without hovering. Consuela, the housekeeper, had opinions about food and rest that she shared with the authority of a woman who had delivered 5 children of her own, and Edna took the advice in the spirit it was offered. Their son was born in November of 1877, in the room where Edna had put up the quilt. He was large and red and furious in the way of healthy newborns, and he announced himself with a lung power that startled the chickens in the yard outside. They named him Walter Henry Merritt, Walter for Nathan's father and Henry for Edna's, own two men who had worked this land and other land before them, and whose names the boy could carry forward as evidence that the past was worth remembering. Nathan held his son in the first hour with the careful enormity of a man who understands that he is holding something irreplaceable. Edna watched from the bed, tired in every part of herself and more alive than she had ever been, and saw on her husband's face the final layer of armor fall away, the last reserve, the part of himself he had not known he was still keeping back. He looked at his son and then at her, and the look was everything she had known was there, fully present, fully open, a man who had arrived completely at the life he was meant for. "Hello, Walter," Nathan said quietly, to the furious red face in his arms. Walter Henry Merritt did not appear immediately placated by the introduction, but he stopped crying within a few minutes, which Edna chose to interpret as agreement. That winter, with the baby in the cradle by the kitchen fire, and the snow coming down on the Kansas prairie, and the cattle settled into the winter pasture, they lived inside the warmth of their family with the particular pleasure of people who have arrived somewhere and know it. Nathan read in the evenings with Walter asleep against his chest. Edna worked on a new piece of needlework, a smaller piece this time, a sampler rather than a quilt, decorative rather than driven by any dream or instruction, just the pleasure of the work itself. Ruth wrote from Millhaven with news of the town and her third child's arrival, and Edna wrote back reliably every week now, no longer every other week, because she had so much to tell. Dorothea Fisk came to supper with her husband George in January and held Walter, with the authority of a woman who has done this many times, and looked at Edna with warm, satisfied approval. "I knew it," she said, which was Dorothea's standard line about any positive development she had observed from any distance, and Edna only smiled because in this case, Dorothea had indeed known it before Edna would admit to it. In the spring of 1878, Edna expanded her garden significantly, planting along the creek bottom with the good soil her uncle had left her, and the garden became one of the things she was proudest of in all her years in Caldwell, the rows of vegetables and the herb beds, and later the flower borders that were purely for pleasure, because she had earned the right to some things that were purely for pleasure. Nathan built her a proper kitchen garden fence with a gate that closed securely, an act that required more lumber and labor than she would have asked for, but which she accepted as the language he spoke when affection needed to be made physical and functional. Caldwell grew around them in those years, and changed. The cattle drives continued through the late 1870s, and the town remained rough-edged, but the homesteaders were digging in, and the school that Patience taught grew, and the church got less embarrassed-looking as the congregation filled it more reliably. There were still injustices. The big cattlemen still pushed where they could, and the town law was still not always applied equally, and the people in the Indian Territory to the south lived under conditions that Edna read about in the papers with the same low fury she brought to the Greer situation, the fury of someone who understands that the West is being built on the suppression of people who were there first, and has no comfortable answer to that knowledge. But her life had the texture of something good. Her husband came in at the end of working days and sat down at her table and told her about the ranch, and she told him about the garden and the chickens, and the letter from Ruth, or the new school reader Patience was using. And Walter grew from the red, furious newborn into a sturdy toddler with his father's brown eyes and his mother's directness of manner, and the quilt stayed on their bed through all of it. They had a second child in 1880, a girl they named Hattie after Edna's grandmother, because of course they did. Hattie Merritt came into the world as mellow as Walter had been loud, a composed and curious infant who looked around at everything with the considering expression of someone conducting a thorough assessment. She had Nathan's stillness and Edna's eyes, which were gray-green, and she was exactly 4 weeks old when Nathan sat in the rocking chair. Edna had brought Hattie's rocking chair from Millhaven, Hattie Shelton's old chair, and kept it in the bedroom corner and rocked his daughter with the quilt spread over both their laps. And Edna, feeding herself standing at the window with her back to them, heard him say, very quietly, to the baby, "There is a woman named Hattie Shelton who dreamed your father into existence. She deserves some thanks." Edna pressed her hand to her mouth and stood very still. She did not let him see her crying. She stood at the window looking at the summer prairie and let her grandmother's dream wash through her. The whole of it, from the rocking chair by the cold hearth in Millhaven to this bedroom in Caldwell, with a man she loved entirely holding a daughter named after the woman who had set everything in motion. She thought of the quilt, which she could see from the corner of her eye, the log cabin squares and the name at the center, spread across the bed where it had been since their first week of marriage. She had made it for a man she'd never met. He had unfolded it and could not speak, and here they were. When Hattie was settled and Nathan came to find her, she was at the kitchen table with her coffee and her composure restored. He sat down across from her and looked at her the way he always looked at her, steadily and without artifice, the warm brown eyes that had assessed her first at the chicken coop and never stopped seeing her clearly. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Edna said. "She is extremely opinionated about everything for someone who cannot yet speak." "She comes by that honestly," he said, and he was smiling. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers, and they sat in the kitchen on a summer morning in 1880 with their children asleep upstairs and their land green outside and the quilt on the bed above their heads. And Edna thought of all the squares she'd sewn in the years before she knew this man, the grief and the solitude and the patient prairie evenings, the thread pulling through fabric in lamplight, a name being made permanent on cloth. She thought of how strange faith is, and how it is almost never the shape you expect, and how the best things are usually both more ordinary and more enormous than anything you could have planned for. The years that followed were full. Walter turned out to have his father's gift for the land and his mother's stubbornness, a combination that made him both capable and occasionally trying, as he grew from toddler to boy to the kind of young person who has strong opinions about cattle management at age 8. Hattie grew into the composed, curious person she had promised to be, with a particular gift for reading and a friendship with Patience, Reeves's younger sister, who had come out from Ohio at Patience's urging, that lasted all their lives. Clara came back with her family for long visits every other year, and the Merritt house was always loud when she arrived, James and little Edna, and eventually a third alderman child running with Walter and Hattie across the creek bottom, while the adults sat on the porch with their coffee and talked. Martin's recovery was full and permanent, and he and Nathan developed the kind of easy friendship that comes from a man being grateful to his brother-in-law without making it a performance. In 1882, Nathan and Lewis, who had been his best hand for 10 years and whom he'd come to think of as a friend rather than an employee, started a small horse-breeding operation alongside the cattle, focusing on the good working quarter horses that the ranches in the area always needed. It grew slowly and then with confidence, and by 1884, it was a significant part of the operation's income. Edna took the bookkeeping for it seriously, having a talent for numbers that Nathan respected without entirely sharing, and their business partnership was in every way an extension of their personal one, complementary, honest, and productive. Sims retired in 1883, his tobacco habit intact, and his back finally objecting to the full physical demands of ranch work. Nathan built him a small house on the property and told him he was welcome to stay as long as he liked, which Sims received with the gruff gratitude of a man who would never say thank you outright but who was visibly moved. He became the person who handled the lighter work and the equipment maintenance, and sat on the porch in the evenings with the tobacco and a view of the creek, and told Walter stories about the old trail drives with a narrator's relish. Ruth Hale visited in 1883, the first time she had made the journey from Millhaven, bringing her now 3 children and an excited energy that turned the Merritt house upside down for a week and left Edna laughing for days after. She saw Edna's life with the clear eyes of someone who had known her before all of it, and she sat with Edna one afternoon in the garden while the children ran riot, and Nathan kept them loosely supervised from the barn door, and she said, "Your grandmother was right." "She usually was," Edna said. "But this was remarkable even for her," Ruth said. "Remarkably right," Edna agreed. Ruth looked at Nathan across the yard and looked back at Edna. "He is exactly what you needed. He is exactly who I was making a quilt for," Edna said, "which I realize is not the way things are supposed to work." "Things are supposed to work however they actually work," Ruth said, in the tone she used for wisdom that she'd arrived at through experience rather than theory. "The rest is just people arguing with evidence." The quilt remained on their bed. It grew soft with years of use, the colors fading gently, the squares settling into each other with the comfortable intimacy of long-associated things. The stitching held, as good stitching will, the blue-black thread still firm against the deep blue cotton, his name still precise and legible at the center. When Hattie was old enough to understand it, she asked her mother about it, tracing the letters with a child's careful finger. Edna sat on the bed beside her daughter and told her the whole story. Hattie the grandmother, the dream, the rocking chair, the cold hearth, the October morning in 1873, and the needle-pulling blue-black thread through blue cotton in a lamplit kitchen in Millhaven. Hattie Merritt listened with the same considering expression she had brought to the world as an infant. When Edna finished, she said, "So you sewed Daddy's name before you knew him?" "Yes," Edna said, "and then you found him." "Then I found him." Hattie looked at the quilt for a long moment. "Great-grandmother Hattie was very clever," she said finally. "She was," Edna agreed. "Cleverer than me sometimes." "Not cleverer," Hattie said with the gravity of an 8-year-old delivering a verdict. "She just had a better view." Edna looked at her daughter and felt the thing move through her that always moved through her at moments like this, the accumulated weight and warmth of a life that had turned out better than she'd planned because she had been willing to trust something she couldn't entirely explain. She kissed the top of Hattie's head, which smelled of prairie wind and soap, and said, "Yes, that's exactly right." Nathan found them like that when he came up from the barn, mother and daughter on the bed with the quilt between them. He leaned in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight with the expression Edna knew best, the soft, unguarded, fully present one. Then he came in and sat on the other side of Hattie and put his arm around both of them, and the 3 of them sat together on the bed with the quilt that had held a name for 3 years before the name became a person, before the person became a husband and a father and a home. "Your mother made this before she met me," Nathan told Hattie, because apparently this was an evening for the story. "I know," Hattie said. "She just told me. Great-grandmother had a dream." "She did," Nathan said. "Do you think she knew it would really happen?" Hattie asked. "Or was she just hoping?" Nathan looked at Edna over their daughter's head. Edna smiled. "I think she knew the difference between a dream and a wish," she said. "I think this was more than a wish." "But how could she know?" Hattie pressed, "because she was 8 and precision mattered." "I don't know," Nathan said honestly and gently. "Some things don't come with explanations, they just come, and if you're paying attention you recognize them when they arrive." Hattie seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked at the quilt again. "It's very beautiful," she said. "She made it beautifully." "Yes," Nathan said. "She did." He reached across Hattie and found Edna's hand, and she felt his thumb trace over her knuckles the way it had since early in their marriage, the particular tenderness of a man who has found his way to being tender and is not embarrassed by it. She looked at him and he looked at her, and Hattie, sitting between them, looked back and forth between her parents with the expression of a person watching something she cannot entirely decipher but instinctively understands is important. The following Sunday, Edna went to church and sat in the pew beside Dorothea, And the service was the ordinary Sunday service in the Caldwell church, with its slightly embarrassed look on the outside, and its entirely sincere congregation on the inside. And she sat in the familiar pew with her husband on one side, and her daughter on the other, and her son in the pew ahead of her, fidgeting in the way of all 8-year-old boys in church. And she listened to the words that were said and thought about faith. About the particular kind of faith that is not certainty, but is nevertheless a commitment. The faith that pulls a needle through cloth in lamplight for a man you have never seen, because someone who loves you told you he was coming and something inside you believed them. She had not been certain. She had been afraid and doubtful and sometimes had gone weeks without opening the cedar chest. But she had not stopped. She had kept going, the way you keep going on a long walk when you cannot see the destination but your feet remember the direction. And the destination had met her more than halfway, had come riding up her gate on a bay horse with his hat pushed back, and his direct brown eyes and his hand eventually finding hers across a quilt spread on a kitchen table. Nathan was looking at her. He did this sometimes in church, not irreverently but with the attention of a man who is aware of the person beside him and grateful for the awareness. She felt his eyes and turned, and he smiled the real smile, the one that reached all the way into his face, and she smiled back with the fullness of a woman who is entirely, properly, unambiguously home. The Kansas light came through the church windows and fell on the congregation in the way of Sunday mornings in late summer, gold and unhurried and expansive. Outside, the prairie ran south to the Indian Territory and north to wherever you were going, and the cattle were in the pasture and the horses in the paddock, and the quilt was on the bed at home, his name at the center of it, and the years ahead were all still to be lived. In the autumn of 1885, they planted a grove of cottonwood trees along the east fence line, Nathan and Edna and Walter and Hattie, all four of them in the October air with the sky the particular deep blue of Kansas fall, and the light running horizontal and gold across the prairie. They planted 12 trees, one for every year since Nathan's father had started the operation, one for every square of quilt Edna had made in the years before, which was the kind of coincidence she had stopped being surprised by. They worked until the light failed and then stood at the fence line and looked at their row of small trees, no taller than Walter yet, 12 young cottonwoods that would grow tall and wide, and shade that fence line for 100 years after all of them were gone. How long until they're big? Walter asked. 20 years for a good size, Nathan said. 50 for real shade. Walter considered this. We won't see 50 years of them. No, Nathan said. But they will, and whoever comes after will. Walter seemed to find this acceptable. He was 10 years old and already practical about the long view, which his father had taught him by example, and his mother had demonstrated by making quilts for men she'd never met. The long view was the family perspective. Hattie was holding Edna's hand. She looked up at the trees in the last light and then up at her mother. Did you know, she said, that cottonwoods are the only tree that makes a sound like rain when the wind goes through them? I did know that, Edna said. Is that why you chose them? Edna looked at Nathan. He was looking at the trees with his profile to her, calm and good and present, everything he had been from the first morning at the chicken coop. She thought of all the years the quilt had waited in the cedar chest, blue-black thread on blue cotton, waiting for him to unfold it. She thought of his hands on it at the kitchen table, the way he had traced his own name with one finger, the silence that was not emptiness but the fullness of something too large for words. No, she said, but it's a good reason. The wind came across the prairie and went through the small cottonwood leaves, and the sound was exactly what Hattie had said. It was like rain beginning, like the first sound of something that is going to be wonderful, like the opening note of a thing that will last. Nathan turned from the trees and found her eyes across the children's heads, and she saw in his face the same thing she had seen the morning at the kitchen table when he'd unfolded a quilt and could not speak, the full presence, the complete arrival, The man who had been dreamed into her life before she knew his face and who had justified every stitch. She squeezed Hattie's hand. She listened to the trees. She stood in her life, which was the one she had been building since before she'd known she was building it, since a grandmother in a rocking chair had looked at her with faded blue eyes and told her a name, and she thought, yes, this is it. This is all of it. This is the dream and the quilt and the man and the children and the land and the trees that will make rain sound for 100 years, and the long evening still ahead and tomorrow and all the days after that. This was every stitch worth making. She walked back across the field with her family in the last of the Kansas light, toward the house where the quilt was on the bed, and the coffee would need making, and the evening was waiting. And she walked with the sure and grateful step of a woman who had trusted something she couldn't see and had been right.